I'm a god.
Well, what if there is no tomorrow?
I'm a god.
There wasn't one today.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Time to Rewind, a podcast stuck in its own time loop right along with the movies we discuss. And this season we're taking a look at Groundhog Day after day after day after day after day. I'm your host Bubba Wheat from Flights, Tights, and Movie Nights, and in this episode we're discussing Phil's 7th Groundhog Day that starts at 43 minutes and 18 seconds, with Phil giving his Groundhog's Day report with a slight Clint Eastwood homage before having a conversation with Rita like more normal people talk, and ends at 46 minutes and 38 seconds, with Phil remembering that Rita is going to order sweet vermouth on the rocks with a twist. Today my guest is Sean, host of Next Scene Podcast, and co-host of Groundhog Minute. How are you doing today?
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me.
Sure, it's great to have you on. When doing my research for this podcast, aside from various Google searches, the bulk of my Groundhog Day research, besides watching the movie as well, was just binging through Groundhog Minutes and just, stealing all the research that you and Dave did.
All right, great. Well, glad to be of service.
But, in terms of this iteration of the loop here in Groundhog Day, the first thing that I do have to ask you is, does Phil feel lucky? Well, does he, punk?
That's the question you have to ask yourself. I don't know if he does feel lucky at this point.
This really ties into yesterday's loop where Phil was dressed in a Clint Eastwood homage.
Mm-hmm. The Phil with no name.
Named Bronco.
Or Bronco.
I don't know. Is this really how normal people talk?
Yeah, see, I no. I don't know. See, I'm really bad at small talk, maybe even worse than Phil Connors is. So I'm not quite sure how you, kind of how you chat up even coworkers, even, forget a stranger, forget talking to strangers. Yeah, my coworkers will tell you it takes a good 3 or 4 years before I start talking about anything other than work itself, to kind of loosen up and reach this point. And maybe Phil has been through, 3 or 4 years. So maybe he is, feeling lucky. He's getting more relaxed. So, at this point, we haven't been through, I assume, are we assuming all the listeners have seen the movie through? Are we okay with spoilers?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. So, I mean, we're not in the death spiral, the depression that Phil hits at some point. We've been through, we've seen a little bit of his love life or his dating life here in Punxsutawney. So maybe he is feeling lucky, because one particular thing, and when you kind of announced the show, and I was very excited because I love this movie and I enjoy watching it and I enjoy talking about it. So I was excited, in that regards. And then you said, okay, kind of give me choice, do you have your preference? What kind of minutes you want to talk about? And I thought this was a good point, because it's interesting. Like, this is different because we see Phil with Rita. We didn't really get much that second date. We just see him in the getup and they're going to see Heidi too. But Rita's different than all the other women in Punxsutawney. That Rita knew him before. She knows him from, they just met last night or yesterday, I guess yesterday morning, they just met, but she does know him at least a little bit from outside the loop.
Yeah, he's not starting at 0. He's starting at -5.
Yeah. So he's already behind the ball. So it's a little bit different. He's got to kind of change up, his approach on how he's going to get to know her and ultimately attempt to seduce her. So maybe he feels like all those other women were like practice, and he feels like, okay, I've got my game on. Maybe he's cut down the number of loops. Like, maybe it took 15 loops to really get Nancy to come up to his room. And then, the next one, it was only 12 and 10. And maybe he's got it down where he manages to gather all the data he needs, that first time, and like the second loop, the second day is when he can kind of reliably get a woman up to his room, and he's figured, wow, if I can do that with these women that don't know me at all, maybe I can work my charms.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. That's why he's asking this barrage of questions, like he's, a 5-year-old in the Y stage.
Again, going back to what I said about, I'm kind of not good at small talk, because like this kind of works both ways. On the one hand, we kind of saw the way he worked Nancy, and we can kind of see like he's, he can't pretend they went to school together, but he's kind of fishing for things that he can use later. But at the same time, it's like, this is kind of good. I mean, isn't that what you're like, to get to know someone? You don't talk about yourself. You're supposed to be interested in them and ask a lot of questions, and like open-ended questions, not yes or no kind of stuff, but not do you like fudge, not stuff like that, but these opened up things. What do you want out of life? Kind of open-ended questions that allow the person to show their personality. And really, I mean, that's such an open-ended question. You could really talk about almost anything, after that. I mean, it kind of follows it up with, are you seeing anyone? And that's a little more specific in terms of what kind of follow-up. But yeah, to just say, what do you want out of life? What do you like? What are you looking for? Who's your perfect guy?
And I think that the date, over these next few repetitions, it does kind of ebb and flow between questions and things where he's actually getting to know Rita, and also going back to just fishing for what's going to make Rita like him.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder, like, so there's two things going on, I think, at least two. One is obviously he's trying to seduce her. He's trying to gather information that he can kind of use in a future loop. I also think he's kind of bored. Like, he generally does want to make conversation. And even though, on one level, he knows she's going to forget this the next day, that he's going to go through this loop and start all over again. On the other hand, because they did know each other outside the loop before this happened, maybe he feels like he can actually start building something, and just trying to break up the monotony of every day in the same place. So maybe there is some sincerity in Phil and what he's trying to do here, and he's trying to make a connection. I mean, there's in terms of like, who really knows this guy, who can he kind of connect to on another level. There's Rita, there's Larry, and there's Ned. The people that knew Phil outside of the loop. And of those three, I agree. If I had to spend eternity or close to it with one of those three people, nothing against Larry or Ned. They're great guys, but I would choose Rita as well.
Yeah, and I think that reminds me of something that's been discussed about this film, is like the 5 stages of grief. Mm-hmm. And this puts him into the second stage, which is bargaining, where he's trying to find meaning in Rita. And I think that it also ties in a little bit to his denial, and that goes back just 2 or 3 days, or just a couple days, where he was with Nancy and he kept saying Rita. And personally, I think that was really his first time where he thinks that maybe he actually does have feelings for Rita. But at the time, he's just like, well, who's that? He just brushes it off. And I think that was like kind of a combination of denial and then also a little bit of bargaining. But I think he was in denial with his feelings towards Rita. And I know you guys talked about how I think in the earlier version of the script, and I think also in the musical, it's mentioned at this point where he tries dating every single eligible bachelorette in Punxsutawney. And I do think that that's alluded to in this movie, even though we just see Nancy and then the unnamed woman at Heidi too.
Yeah, I definitely think, Danny Rubin. Sorry, I blanked on the screen for a moment. And I think Danny Rubin had either talked about or wrote about it that, Phil dates every eligible woman between 18 and 80 in Punxsutawney. And I'm guessing, you know what? There's probably a few men in there as well. I mean, you've got time to experiment, even if it's not, if it's not your thing, that's fine. But hey, you don't know it's not
at least
your
you
thing
try.
until you try it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's kind of sowing his wild oats, I guess you could say.
I'd like to think that there was also a little bit of denial, and that his date with Nancy is probably not the only time that his thoughts turned to Rita. And I think that was, him doing some avoidance, just trying to avoid his own feelings for Rita. And then this is him, in a way, trying to explore those feelings for Rita, but he's also in a very conquest mindset.
That's interesting. That's really, yeah, I'm not really sure what to make of him calling out Rita, because one thing I always think is like he doesn't really know Rita. I mean, at the end, we're supposed to think this is a happy ending and a kind of a love story that they run away together. But, I kind of think of people that, the saying, the kind of Freakonomics and the 10,000 hours. And, it's 10,000 hours of study or practice that makes, kind of makes you an expert. And the important thing, it's not just doing something for 10,000 hours. It's directed practice. It's doing it. It's figuring out, where you're having trouble, or once you master something, master something at a certain level, move to another layer and kind of continually challenge yourself. I've also heard it in the professional world where they talk about you've got people that have 5 years of experience and people that have 1 year of experience that they've done 5 times. That isn't quite the same thing. And I think there's some of that with Phil where it's like, okay, maybe he spent 1,000 days, 10,000 days, who knows how many days. And in another sense, well, no, he's only spent 1 day with Rita that he's done 1,000 times or 10,000 times or so many times. So like, how well does he really know her? Can he really love her? And particularly early on, we're talking about these times where he's calling out Rita's name when he's with Nancy. Like, I don't know, because that kind of thing, when you hear about, someone calling out someone else's name, usually it's an ex. Usually like you're married or you date for a long time and then you break up and you're with someone else and you call out your ex's name. And you can see, well, okay, it's a habit. You're used to being with this one person in romantic or intimate situations. So there's one name that you'd always be saying, where it's like Phil would never be kissing and say Rita or making love or any of these other, like he would never have been in that situation before and calling out her name.
And on my count, that day was his 5th repetition. And I feel like it actually was his 5th repetition because things that happened at the end of the previous day were specifically referenced early in the next day. So it made sense, at least to me, that they did happen one after the other after the other. And it's, by my count, it's not until he robs the armored car that's when we have missing days. That would have been his 5th day of knowing Rita.
Yeah, I think that's the first time. I mean, depending on how smooth an operator we think Phil is and how susceptible Nancy is to suggestion and how long we think that takes. Yeah, that may have only been the second day that he gets her up into the room. And then, but like the bank heist where he, like, the gust of wind, the dog barking, a car goes back, like he knows everything down to the second where there's a definite feeling that, okay, he's done this a lot more times than we're seeing. He hasn't just been there once before to plan this out. Like he must have gone through a few times at least to kind of plan that heist and everything. So yeah, so there's certainly a lot of days we don't see.
Yeah, my personal guesstimation is I gave it about 150 days. That includes time spent with other women before at Heidi too. I think this is the perfect time to ask because I am curious. This is something that I'm keeping track of, and I'm curious what my guests think. At this point in the movie, which is just the day after the bank robbery in Heidi 2. How long do you think Phil's been stuck in Groundhog Day at this point?
Yeah, that's really tough. And I kind of avoid it. You think it's strange someone would, would have a podcast where we did 100 episodes, covered it 1 minute at a time, do 100 episodes talking about Groundhog Day. And we really didn't dive into how many days, how long the whole thing takes, or, how long it's been at particular moments. And,
yeah, I think sometimes whenever you're looking at something in tiny detail, you sometimes to miss the bigger picture.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there's so many unknowns. I mean, we can, and I will give an opinion. I will answer the question. There's so many assumptions. People talking about that 10,000 hours to, gain proficiency. People talk about, well, he learns French and he knows to play the piano. It's like, well, no, he recites one poem that's really lyrics to a song. So maybe he just listened to the record a bunch of times and, memorized the song that way.
Which we're not quite there yet, but here, just a couple more episodes.
Yeah, I'm getting ahead of us a little bit. So it's like, did he really learn French? Does he really know how to play the piano? We see him play basically 2 songs. Mm-hmm. That he plays are parts of 2 songs. So it's like, can you, and you have to learn somewhat just to learn a song, but that doesn't necessarily make him an all-around expert on the piano. So at this point, but we've seen the bank heist. Presumably he's gone through, I believe it was Danny Rubin who said he dated all the eligible women in town from 18 to 80. But we also know Phil can plan out a day when we see that perfect day at the end where he's changing a tire and performing the Heimlich and catching a kid. I don't imagine he's talking to one woman, finding out where she went to high school, and then going back to his room for the rest of the day. He can go through a crowd and chat up a bunch of different people, and then hit the library and study French for a little bit and practice a little bit piano, and then grab the chainsaw and hit the ice. He can plan out a day and do a lot of different things. So you can't say, well, he seduced 100 women and each of them took 10 days, and therefore that's 1,000 days. So it's not quite that simple. So there's a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of unknowns that we have to kind of fill in.
That actually brings up a point too that I also don't think was mentioned before. Is that if you think about it, he really has almost 24 hours in his day, mm-hmm. because his body completely resets then at 6 a.m. to where he wakes up with supposedly, a full rested night of sleep. So he could actually stay up all day doing whatever he needs to plan and not have to worry about sleep either.
Yeah. So at this point, it's still relatively early. So what has he done? He's done a bank heist. He seduced a bunch of women.
And he said that he's seen Heidi 2 over 100 times. And then,
and
that was just yesterday.
Yeah, and I think there's some hints and there's some things that are really they're funny lines where the people in the film, the characters may think he's kidding or he's being hyperbolic, but we can kind of take it literally. He talks about, how many times has he seen Heidi, or how long does it take before you become an expert at tossing a playing card into a hat and things like that, so he does gives us some hints. I'm thinking at this point, it's probably on the order of 1,000 days. So I'm thinking like 2.5, 3 years, in that range.
Okay.
Yeah, just trying to, and that, I'm presuming again that he's tried to, or he seduced, every eligible person in town that he could. I'm trying to think, I'm assuming that, or thinking that even if he can kind of talk to multiple people and gathering information during the day, that he probably only has one date a night. I like to think the best of Phil. I'm hoping he's not the kind of guy who's like, well, I've got dinner with Nancy at 8, and then at 10, I'm going to see Susan, and then there's Betty that's working the late shift at the diner. She gets off at midnight, and then I'm going. I'm thinking, okay, at least the evening hours, it's only one hookup. But yeah, like you said, he's got the 24 hours and he's not going anywhere. So who knows? But I'm thinking it's a few years. It's enough that he's comfortable. He's calmed down. He's kind of relaxed. He can have this chit chat with Rita that feels kind of natural. You know, he hasn't hit the depression stage yet. And he certainly hasn't gone through to, you know, the state we get at the end. So that'd be my guess. Yeah, 2.5, 3 years. Probably like, you know, the high triple digits in terms of days of loops that he's been through.
I can definitely see that. And then the conversation does move into the diner. And something that I noticed is we do see some clocks in the diner, which gives us a time period, even though there are 3 clocks there. And 2 of the clocks say 11:30. And this is the 3rd time he's been there, and they've said 11:30 the 2 previous times. But this time I was actually able to see at least a bit of the upper clock. And the hour hand is at 4. And you can't quite see the minute hand, but I personally I think it would be interesting if the minute hand was at 4, so it was 4:04, which is a same time that was just back in day 2.
Yeah, and I don't know if those clocks are those functioning or are they just decorative.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. My personal guess is that the bottom 2 clocks were purposefully set at 11:30 by the filmmakers. And then they didn't think that the top clock would be on screen, so I think the top clock may be what the actual time is when they were filming.
Okay, yeah, I like that. Because it is a little bit later. So at this point, he's doing the broadcast. I think he's got past the point where he's blowing it off. So he's like doing the broadcast. We see him, you know, in front of the camera saying, "Does Phil feel lucky?" Then going back to the truck with Rita, I guess, you know, boom, you know, sending the video by satellite back to the station in Pittsburgh, and then over the diner for coffee and a donut. Although I guess it's is it like 6:37 a.m. that
I think it's like 7:34 a.m. is whenever the Groundhog comes out.
Yeah, the actual Groundhog thing. So yeah, so then it would be, you know, it could still be late morning, but around 11:30. That sounds right. Perfect time to get philosophical with Rita and her life.
Of course, you know, Phil removes the. I looked it up, and I'm pretty sure it's the distributor cap that he takes off of the van. And I'm not like a super car guy, but I believe that what the distributor cap actually does is it controls the timing of the firing of the spark plugs in the engine. So removing that would effectively disable the vehicle pretty well. And I also noticed this woman recognizes Phil Connors, and she's excited that it's Phil Connors, and she's holding a camera, like an actual camera, but she doesn't ask to take a picture.
But she doesn't ask to take a picture. Well, this is back in the day of film. You know, I think this is before digital camera, so, you know, you wouldn't necessarily waste use some film on something unless you were really sure you wanted it. So, I mean, she recognizes Phil, but he's just a weatherman after all. That's funny. Yeah, I never thought of it like that. She sees him, but doesn't take the picture. Yeah. But this is interesting, going back to what you're saying about what you were saying about Phil having 24 hours and me saying about him planning his day, where he's like, so he's gotten to the point where he's got a definite agenda of what he wants to do, and he's kind of planned things out, and he realizes, I don't have time to drive out to the sticks and get snowed in and see the road is closed and turn around and come back to town. That he's got like a schedule he wants to keep, where he's like, okay, you know, he's shaping the day. You know, he's saying, okay, I want to make sure I've got time for these things and not these other things. So, so let's kill the van. We'll just skip the ride. Of course, I mean, eventually he gets to the point where he's just like, I'm not going. You know, he just tells Larry, I'm not going. I guess he probably gets tired of. He probably realizes, well, this is 5 minutes of messing with the van, or I could just take 1 minute and tell Larry I'm not going with him. But yeah, so he's disabling the van. I know nothing about cars. So yeah, sure, distributor, spark plugs firing.
And there were just a couple other little details in the background that I noticed that I wanted to at least mention. There is, whenever he walks into the hotel bar, we do get to see the sign for the Groundhog Day banquet provided by the Inner Circle at the Pennsylvania Hotel Ballroom.
Yeah. But 7 p.m. till midnight, I think, or 7 to 11.
Yeah, I couldn't make out the time on my copy, but yeah, I was just able to see the rest of it. And then also, right behind Rita, there's a couple photos of Groundhog beauty queens. And I was curious, and I was trying to look up to see if like Groundhog Day beauty pageants was a thing, but I couldn't find a single thing. I did actually find, and I won't go into it now, but I did actually start to look into the archives of the Punxsutawney Spirit.
Mm-hmm.
They have a scan from 1887 and then 1911 are the two earliest ones that have something to mention about Groundhog Day. And the 1887, it just says that today is a Groundhog Day, but as of going to press, we don't know if the beast has seen its shadow. That's the only thing that it has to say about Groundhog Day.
All right.
In 1887. And then 1911 has a big long article, but I'm going to save that one for later.
All right. Yeah, we can save that for later. Yeah, and we get our introduction to this bartender.
Yeah.
We will see over and over again, like many of the denizens of Punxsutawney. But he doesn't get a lot of lines. It's not a big part, but I think it's an important part. We'll see him a couple more times. We'll spend some time in the bar with our sweet vermouth with a twist.
Yeah, he gets a lot of, head shaking acting.
Yeah.
Well, that's all I have for today's loop. Was there anything else that you had?
No, I think that's it. I got some other things, but I'll save it. I hope I'm not spoiling it for the listener to say I will be coming back for the next loop. So I'll save some for next time. How about that?
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, I'd like to thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to talk to you tomorrow on the next Groundhog Day. But why don't you go ahead and let everybody know where else you can be found online?
Sure. Well, as you said in your introduction, my current podcast is Next Scene. We're at nextscenepod.com, and that's a show I do with my brother where we take on pop culture one scene at a time. It's mostly movies, but we do a little bit of TV. We've done music. We do some other things, but we'll take like one episode of a TV show or one scene from a movie, and we talk about it, and then for the next episode, we're on to the next scene. And that's why we call that Next Scene Podcast.
All right. And as always, I'm Bubba Wheat from Flights, Tights, and MovieNights.com, where I have written reviews for over 500 different superhero and comic book movies. And you can find It's Time to Rewind on Anchor.fm and anywhere else you can find podcasts. And, until the next Groundhog Day, am I feeling lucky? And, I'm hopefully by the end of this podcast, I will have repeated this day enough times to come up with a good ending tagline.
I'm a god. Well, what if there is no tomorrow? I'm a god. There wasn't one today. I'm just trying to talk like normal people talk. Isn't this how they talk?
Close.